She came to be a bride. She stayed to save an entire town. The moment Helena Vogel stepped off that stagecoach in Red Hollow, the man she was supposed to marry looked her up and down and laughed. Not a quiet, uncomfortable laugh. A loud, humiliating one, right there in the dirt, in front of every soul in town. "I ordered a wife," Gideon Mercer said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Not a burden." Most women would have wept. Most would have climbed back on that coach and never looked back. Helena picked up her bag and asked to see the kitchen. If you've ever been underestimated, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Drop a like. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Red Hollow, Wyoming Territory. Autumn, 1883. The stagecoach arrived 40 minutes late, rattling into Red Hollow, like a wounded animal limping across the last stretch of open plain. Dust billowed behind it in great amber clouds, the kind that coated your teeth and stung your eyes and reminded you, in case you'd forgotten, that this was not a forgiving land. Red Hollow itself was the sort of town that appeared on maps only because cartographers felt sorry for it. 24 buildings hunched along a single main street, their painted signs bleached to near illegibility by 3 consecutive summers of brutal sun. A blacksmith, a general store, a livery stable with a lopsided roof. And at the far end of the street, occupying the largest lot as though size alone could compensate for its hollowness, stood the Mercer Saloon and the adjoining ranch house, both of them wearing the particular look of a place that had once been proud and had since stopped trying. The people of Red Hollow lined the street the way small-town people do when anything at all interrupts the boredom. Not because they cared, necessarily, but because there was simply nothing else to look at. Word had spread quickly, as it always does in a town with more time than activity. Gideon Mercer had sent away for a bride. A mail-order arrangement, brokered through an agency in St. Louis. The widow Calloway had told the seamstress, who told the barber, who told everyone else that the woman coming was German, educated, and had experience managing a household. Several of the ranch wives had expressed cautious approval. A capable woman might do Gideon Mercer some good, they agreed. Lord knew the man needed something. Gideon himself stood at the front of the gathered crowd, arms folded across his chest, jaw set in that particular way of his that meant he was bracing for disappointment. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of slate in rain. He was not an ugly man. He was simply a hard one. The kind of hard that comes not from cruelty, but from a series of losses so relentless that a man eventually stops reaching for anything soft because soft things seem to break. His ranch, what remained of it, was struggling. 3 of his best hands had quit by midsummer. His saloon had half the customers it once did. His books, which he barely understood, showed a ledger of quiet disaster. He needed help. Practical, reliable, capable help. That was what he'd requested through the agency. That was the arrangement. The stagecoach door swung open. Helena Vogel stepped down onto the dirt road of Red Hollow, and for one suspended moment, there was silence. She was 28 years old, with honey blonde hair pinned beneath a sensible traveling bonnet, pale blue eyes that took in her surroundings with quiet, steady intelligence, and a figure that was, there was no diplomatic way to say this in 1883, and the people of Red Hollow were not known for their diplomacy. Full. Generously, unmistakably, substantially full. Her traveling dress was clean and well-made, her boots practical, her posture impeccably upright. She carried a single large trunk, a leather satchel worn soft with use, and a small tin box that she held close to her side as though it contained something irreplaceable. She looked at the crowd assembled before her with an expression that was neither frightened nor defiant, just calm, observant, like a woman who had learned long ago to take the measure of a room before deciding how to stand in it. Then the laughter started. It was a boy of about 12 who broke first. A ranch hand's son perched on a fence post at the edge of the crowd, but within seconds it had spread, quietly at first, and then not quietly at all. Murmurs became snickers. Someone said something just below audible. The seamstress pressed her lips together in an expression that was not quite a smile, but close enough. The barber shook his head. Helena did not look away. She did not flush or flinch or drop her gaze to the dirt. She stood exactly where she had stopped, her tin box held against her side, and she watched the crowd with those steady pale blue eyes until the worst of the noise had passed. It was Gideon who finished it. He unfolded his arms and walked toward her with the deliberate stride of a man who is doing something he wants to get over with. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough to be heard clearly, not close enough to suggest any kind of welcome. He looked at her, just looked, without speaking, for a beat that stretched long enough to become its own kind of cruelty. Then he said, loud enough for every person on that street to hear every word, "I put in for a capable woman, someone who could work, someone who could manage things." He tilted his head slightly, as though the next part pained him, though his voice carried no particular pain in it. "I didn't put in for a burden." The silence that followed was absolute. Helena held his gaze for a long moment, a very long moment. Long enough that a few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, sensing something they couldn't quite name, some quality in her stillness that didn't feel like surrender. Then she said, very quietly, in English that carried the faint, precise music of a German accent, "Mr. Mercer, where is the kitchen?" Someone laughed again, but it had a different sound this time. Uncertain, a little confused. Gideon blinked. Whatever response he had prepared, and he had prepared one, had been mentally rehearsing the arrangements for her return passage since the moment he'd begun to regret the whole enterprise. It was not that question. "What?" "The kitchen," Helena said in the same measured tone. "In your ranch house. I would like to see it." He stared at her. She waited. Behind them both, the town of Red Hollow stared too. "Follow me," Gideon finally said, because he couldn't think of anything else to do. The kitchen was worse than Helena had expected, and she had expected something difficult. It was a large room, which was its only advantage. Beyond that, a cast iron stove that was coated in grease thick enough to qualify as a second layer of iron, a dry sink with a cracked basin, shelves so bare they seemed almost decorative, and a floor that hadn't been properly swept since some point in the previous calendar year. A single window overlooked the ranch yard, its glass so clouded with dust that the view outside was impressionistic at best. Gideon stood in the doorway, watching her cross the room with that steady stride. She set her satchel down on the table, which at least was solidly built, and her tin box beside it. She opened both with quick, efficient movements. The satchel contained, among other things, a small ledger book, a roll of good German-made kitchen tools, 2 bundles of dried herbs wrapped in linen, and a paper bag of starter culture that she had been carefully maintaining since leaving Hamburg 6 months ago. The tin box contained documents, papers, receipts, letters, and a small leather pouch of savings coins that she had accumulated over 7 years of working in her uncle's bakery in St. Louis. She did not show him any of this. She simply looked at the shelves. "What do you have?" she asked. "What?" "In the larder, the storeroom. What supplies are on the property?" Gideon's expression moved through several states in quick succession: bafflement, irritation, and then a reluctant sort of recalibration. "Some flour, lard, dried beans, half a side of salt pork, not much else. The supply wagon from Carterville doesn't come until the end of the month." "How many men work this ranch?" 8. Down from 14. A muscle moved in his jaw. 3 quit. 3 more I had to let go when the saloon profits dropped. Helena looked at him then, fully, with those steady, pale eyes. "When did they last eat a proper meal?" The question caught him somewhere he wasn't expecting. His expression changed in a way that was barely visible but unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. A quick tightening around the eyes, a fractional drop of something that might, in a more open man, have become shame. "Last week," he said, "I had Mrs. Calloway bring some stew. Before that—" He stopped. "I see," Helena said. She turned back to the shelves. "I will need a lamp. The fire needs to be lit now so the stove can reach temperature before midnight." "Now? It's nearly 7 o'clock in the evening." "I know what time it is, Mr. Mercer." She said it without heat, without any particular edge. It was simply a statement of fact. "By sunrise, every man on this property will have eaten. That was my promise to myself when I stepped off that coach, and I intend to keep it. A lamp, please, and whatever wood you have dry." He looked at her for another long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and went to get the lamp. What happened in the kitchen of the Mercer Ranch between 7 o'clock that evening and the hour before dawn became, in later years, one of those small local legends that gets retold at enough kitchen tables to eventually harden into something close to myth. What Helena Vogel did with a nearly empty larder was not magic. It was something more reliable than magic. It was craft, applied with the unsentimental precision of a woman who had learned to cook in a professional kitchen at the age of 9 and had not stopped learning since. She rendered the lard and used it to fry the cornmeal she found in a sack behind the flour, forgotten, probably, for months, into thick golden cakes. She soaked the dried beans through the night in a pot of salted water she kept at a low simmer, adding the dried herbs from her satchel in quantities that transformed the smell of the kitchen from neglect to something closer to welcome. She found 3 wizened onions in a crate beneath the dry sink and coaxed from them, with patience and the right heat, a deep sweetness that she folded into a gravy built from the salt pork. She found a jar of preserved plums at the very back of the top shelf, behind a tin of rusted nails that had somehow ended up there, and she made from those plums a compote, bright and tart and vivid, that she would use to finish the cornmeal cakes. She worked alone, and she worked quietly, and she worked with the focused efficiency of someone who is most herself when her hands are occupied. The kitchen, which had been a room of defeat, became something else, became warm, became fragrant, became, somewhere around midnight, a place that several of the ranch hands found themselves drifting toward without quite meaning to. They came to the doorway in ones and twos, drawn by the smell of something they hadn't expected. Big men, sun-weathered and wary, with the particular wariness of people who have been disappointed enough times that hope feels like a risk they can't quite afford. They stood at the threshold in their work clothes and their suspicion, and they looked at the strange German woman moving with authority around a kitchen that had been abandoned for months, and they did not know what to do with what they were seeing. She spoke to them without turning from the stove. "Sit down if you like. There's coffee coming." The eldest of them, a man named Walt Pruitt, 47 years old, with hands like knotted rope, stepped inside first. Then, one by one, the others followed. She did not make conversation. She cooked. But she listened, in the thorough, unobtrusive way of a woman who had learned that people talk freely in kitchens, in the dark, when they think no one is paying particular attention. And what she heard, in fragments and half-sentences and the things left unsaid between the words, was the shape of what had gone wrong here. The ranch had been profitable once, good cattle, good water rights, a saloon that served as the only gathering place for 30 miles. Then 2 things had happened in rapid succession. Gideon's wife, Clara, had died of fever 3 years ago, and Silas Brandt had arrived in the county about 18 months after that. No one said Brandt's name directly, not yet, but she heard it in the way Walt Pruitt stopped mid-sentence when he mentioned the new loans on the Hensley place. She heard it in the way the youngest hand, a boy of about 17 named Cody, looked at the table when he said that the Pattersons were probably going to have to sell by spring. She heard it in the careful, deliberate blankness that came over every face when she asked, very gently, who held most of the paper in this valley. "That's complicated," Walt said. "Most things that matter are," Helena replied, and set a cup of coffee in front of him. At 4:45 in the morning, with the sky outside just beginning to separate from darkness into the deep blue that precedes dawn, Helena carried food to the table of the Mercer Ranch kitchen in the quantities that she had promised. The 8 men who worked the ranch ate until the silence at the table was no longer the silence of emptiness, but the different, better silence of people who are full and warm and, for a moment at least, at ease. No one said thank you. Men like these rarely did, not directly, not first thing. But Walt Pruitt, when he pushed back his chair and stood to go, paused at the door and looked at her with an expression she recognized, the particular look of someone recalibrating what they thought they knew about a situation. "You're staying, then?" he said. Helena was already at the stove, washing up. "I live here now," she said simply. Gideon came to the kitchen just before sunrise. He had not slept. She could see that in the set of his shoulders, the darkness beneath his eyes, that suggested he'd spent the hours since 7 o'clock sitting somewhere with whatever thoughts accompanied a man who has made a public mistake that cannot be quietly unmade. He stood in the kitchen doorway, the same doorway where he'd said his piece that afternoon. and looked at the empty plates, the clean table, the pot soaking in the basin, and the small German woman seated at the corner of the table with her ledger open and a pencil moving with quiet industry across a column of figures. "You did it," he said. "I told you I would." He was quiet for a moment. "You shouldn't have been able to. There was nothing in that larder to work with." "There was enough," she said. "There is usually enough, if you know how to look." She did not look up from the ledger. He watched her pencil move for a long moment. "What are you writing?" "A supply list, prioritized by necessity and organized by cost." She turned a page. "Your books are wrong, Mr. Mercer, not fraudulently, just carelessly. You're losing money in at least 4 places that you don't know about yet. I'll have a full accounting ready by tomorrow evening if you want to see it." Another long silence. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "After what I said. In front of everyone." Helena finally set down her pencil and looked at him. The morning light was coming through the dusty window now, pale and cool, and it fell across the table between them and made the kitchen feel, for the first time, like a room where something real might be said. "Because I did not come 3,000 miles to be sent home," she said. "And because your ranch hands haven't had a decent meal in longer than they should have, and because this kitchen has been sitting here empty when it should be the center of everything, and because—" She paused, and something in her voice went quiet and certain at once. "Because I am not a burden, Mr. Mercer, and I intend to prove that, not for you, for myself." She picked up her pencil again. Outside, the sun broke above the rim of the horizon and threw its first long light across the dust of Red Hollow, and the town that had laughed at Helena Vogel the afternoon before began to wake into a day that was, though it did not yet know it, already different from the day before. Gideon Mercer stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time after that. He did not apologize. Not that morning. He was not yet the kind of man who knew how, but he did not leave either. And in the cold mathematics of the frontier where most things are measured not by what is said but by what is done, that, for now, was enough. The supply list Helena had written that first morning was 3 pages long, not because she was extravagant. Every item on those pages was chosen with the precision of someone who understood exactly what each dollar could and could not do, but because the Mercer Ranch had been running on the frontier equivalent of willpower and stubbornness for so long that its basic infrastructure had quietly collapsed around the people living inside it. You could see it everywhere, once you knew how to look. The split hinge on the smokehouse door that let cold air in and cost more in spoiled meat than a new hinge would have cost in a month of Sundays. The flour stored directly on a dirt floor instead of on boards, drawing moisture from the ground in a way that accelerated spoilage by 1/3. The kitchen fire, built too high and too fast every morning by whoever happened to get there first, burning through twice the wood it needed to, and heating the stove unevenly so that whatever cooked on the left side came out different from whatever cooked on the right. These were not the problems of a failing ranch. They were the problems of a grieving one. A ranch where the person who had once known these things, who had minded the hinge and the flour and the fire, was no longer there to mind them. Helena understood this without being told. She had learned to read the language of neglected spaces a long time ago, back in Hamburg, in the years after her mother died and her father's bakery began its slow decline into disorder. Grief did not announce itself loudly in the places people lived. It accumulated quietly, in the small, unmended things, in the details that required just enough attention to be too much for a person who was holding themselves together with what remained after loss had taken its portion. She did not say any of this to Gideon. She simply fixed the hinge. She moved the flour. She taught the youngest hand, Cody, how to build the morning fire correctly, standing beside him in the cold dark of 6 a.m., with her arms folded and her breath making small clouds in the air until he had it right. "Like this?" the boy said, adjusting the kindling arrangement for the 3rd time. "Better. Leave space between the pieces. Fire needs to breathe, the same as anything else." He looked at the stove with the focused anxiety of a 17-year-old being asked to do something he didn't want to get wrong. "How do you know all this stuff?" "I learned it," Helena said, "the same way you are learning it now." He got it right on the 4th attempt. She nodded once, which was enough, and went to start the bread. The bread was the first thing that changed the mood of the ranch in ways that went beyond the practical. There is something about the smell of bread baking in an early morning, something that operates below the level of thought, reaching into some older part of the mind that associates the smell with safety, with someone caring enough to make it. And within a week of Helena's arrival, the ranch hands began appearing in the kitchen a full half hour before they were needed anywhere else. They came in quietly, in ones and twos, and poured themselves coffee from the pot she kept on the back of the stove and sat at the table, and said almost nothing. But they came. Every morning they came. Walt Pruitt was the one who finally said what the others were thinking, about 10 days in, when he set down his coffee cup and looked at Helena with the directness of a man who has decided to dispense with indirection. "You're not what any of us expected," he said. "I'm aware," Helena replied, without looking up from the dough she was working. "I mean that as—" He paused, searching. "I mean it well." She looked up then, looked at him steadily for a moment, this weathered, honest man who had spent 47 years on frontier land and still bothered to mean things well. "I know you do, Walt," she said. "Thank you." What she did not say, because it was not yet the time to say it, was that she had already been in the county clerk's office twice in those 10 days, riding into Red Hollow on the ranch's oldest mare, while the men were occupied with morning chores, studying the public land records with the focused attention she had once applied to her uncle's most complicated seasonal accounts. And what she had found there, in the dry language of deed transfers and loan documents, was a pattern so consistent it could not be coincidence. But that would come later. First, there was the saloon. The Mercer Saloon occupied the front half of the building that shared a wall with the ranch house kitchen, a fact of architectural convenience that had become, over the 3 years since Clara Mercer's death, a kind of symbolic division. The saloon side was Gideon's territory, loud when it was populated, which it increasingly wasn't, and silent in a particular dead way when it wasn't. The kitchen side was, now, Helena's. The wall between them was solid pine, and it did not muffle sound especially well. She had been listening in the evenings to the saloon side, listening to the number of voices, how many, how long they stayed, whether they came back the following evening. The numbers were not encouraging. On a good night, Gideon served 8 or 10 customers. On a slow night, it was 3 or 4 men nursing the same glass for 2 hours because they had nowhere better to be. On the 11th day, she went through the connecting door. Gideon was behind the bar wiping down the counter with the automatic, sightless motion of a man doing something because stopping would require him to decide what to do instead. There were 4 customers, 2 ranch hands from a property to the north, and 2 men she didn't recognize who looked like they were passing through. The air smelled of tobacco and wood smoke and the slightly stale undertone of a room that wasn't being aired properly. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "a word." He looked at her the way he often did when she appeared somewhere he hadn't expected her, with that fractional pause that she was starting to recognize as the gap between the man he'd been used to being and whatever he was still working out how to be now. "Helena." She did not lower her voice, because she was not embarrassed by what she was about to say. "Your saloon food is bad." One of the passing-through customers turned to look. The 2 northern ranch hands exchanged a glance. Gideon set down his cloth. "I don't serve food." "I know," she said. "That's part of the problem." She looked around the room with the same measuring attention she'd given the kitchen 11 days ago. People don't stay where they're not comfortable. They're not comfortable where they're not fed. You have a kitchen producing food every day that is serving 8 men. It could serve 40 without significant additional cost, and the 40 would buy drinks, and the drinks would cover the food and then some, and the word would travel 30 miles in every direction within a month that the Mercer place sets a proper table. The silence was complete. "You want to turn my saloon into a—" Gideon started. "I want to save your ranch," Helena said. And the quietness of the way she said it made it land differently than if she'd raised her voice. "I want to do that by doing what I know how to do. The rest is up to you." He looked at her for a long time. The 4 customers were collectively pretending to be very interested in their glasses. "What would you need?" he finally said. She pulled the folded paper from her apron pocket. She had written it 2 days ago already, and set it on the bar between them. He unfolded it, read it, looked up at her. "This is... You've already priced everything." "Yes." "The return on this..." He ran his finger down the column of figures. "How did you calculate this?" "Based on the current customer pattern, the capacity of the room, average spend per customer in establishments of this type, and a conservative estimate of the word-of-mouth effect across neighboring properties within a 20-mile radius. She paused. I was conservative. The actual return will likely be higher. Gideon set the paper down very carefully, the way people handle things they are not yet sure they trust themselves with. Then he nodded once, the same way she nodded when Cody got the fire right. All right, he said. All right. The first public supper at the Mercer Saloon happened on a Thursday, 2 weeks after Helena's arrival. She did not advertise it, exactly. She mentioned it to Walt, who mentioned it to the hands on the neighboring Patterson ranch when he rode out to return a borrowed tool, and the word moved outward from there with the speed that only frontier gossip achieves. By 5 o'clock, there were 11 people at the tables. By 6, there were 23. By 7, every seat was occupied, and 3 men were standing at the bar, eating off plates balanced on their forearms, and the noise level had climbed from the dead-near silence of recent months to something loud and warm and alive. Helena cooked. She moved through the kitchen with Cody beside her, the boy proving surprisingly quick once he had something concrete to learn, the two of them working with a rhythm that had developed almost without either of them noticing. She plated braised salt pork with potato dumplings and a dark, sweet onion gravy, served with good bread and apple butter that she had put up herself in a single afternoon when Gideon had come back from Carterville with 3 bushels of late-season apples and a look on his face that was still trying not to be hopeful. She did not go into the saloon that evening. She did not need to. She could hear it through the wall. Around 8 o'clock, Gideon came through the connecting door. He was not a man who smiled easily or often, and what was on his face now was not exactly a smile. It was something slightly more complicated, something that existed in the space between relief and wonder, and a cautious reluctance to believe that something was actually working. They're asking if this is a regular thing, he said. Tell them every Thursday and Saturday to start. She was already at the stove, managing 3 pots simultaneously. If the numbers hold for a month, we add Wednesday. He stood there for a moment, and she could feel him working through something. Helena, the bread for tomorrow needs to go in before you start whatever conversation you're about to start, she said. You can talk while I work. He almost smiled at that. Almost. I was going to say that I was wrong about what I said when you arrived. Helena was quiet for a moment. She shaped the bread loaves with practiced efficiency, pressing and folding, the dough giving smoothly under her hands. I know you were, she said. That's all you're going to say. What else is there to say? You were wrong, and I'm still here, and the ranch is doing better. That seems like enough. Another pause. Most people would want an apology. Most people want a lot of things, Helena said. I want a functioning smokehouse and a second barrel of pickling brine before the first frost. If you want to help with something, those are the things that need doing. He left to deal with the smokehouse. She allowed herself just briefly, in the empty kitchen, the smallest possible version of a smile. But it was 2 weeks after that first Thursday supper, 4 weeks after her arrival, when the ranch had stabilized enough that she could think beyond the next meal, the next supply list, the next repair, that Helena Vogel began to understand the true shape of the trouble that had settled over Red Hollow. It started with the Pattersons. Nora Patterson was a woman of about 40, raw-boned and capable, who arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning with a preserves jar of apple jelly she'd put up herself and an expression she was working very hard to keep neutral. Helena recognized that expression immediately. Recognized it the way you recognize a language you learned young, before you knew you were learning it. It was the expression of a woman who needed help and was ashamed to need it. She sat Nora down at the kitchen table and put coffee in front of her and waited. It took about 15 minutes of conversation about nothing. The apple jelly, the coming weather, whether the Hensley children had recovered from their summer colds, before Nora set down her cup and said, without meeting Helena's eyes, "We got a letter from Brant's office last week." Helena kept her face still. She had heard that name twice now, in the fragmented nighttime conversations of the kitchen and in the land records at the county clerk's office, and both times it had been accompanied by the same quality of silence that surrounds something people have decided is too dangerous to discuss directly. What kind of letter? The kind that says we have 60 days to make good on the loan or forfeit the property. Nora's voice was flat and controlled in the way that voices get when the alternative is falling apart. The thing is, and this is the part I can't make sense of, I know what Roy agreed to when he signed that paper. I was sitting right there. The payment terms were one thing, and now this letter says something else, and I don't... She stopped. I don't know enough about these things to know if I'm confused or if something is wrong. Do you have the original loan document? Helena asked. Roy does. It's in the lockbox. I'd like to see it, Helena said. If Roy's willing to bring it by, I won't pretend to be a lawyer. I'm not. But I understand financial documents, and I'd like to look at it before you decide anything. Nora finally looked up. Her eyes were dry because she was the kind of woman who had decided somewhere along the way that she was not going to cry about things she might still be able to fight. Why would you do that for us? We don't have anything to offer you. Helena looked at her evenly. You brought apple jelly, she said. That's enough. Roy Patterson came by the following evening with a lockbox and a handshake that conveyed in the compressed language of a man who doesn't say much, both gratitude and desperation. Helena sat at the kitchen table with the loan document, a lamp pulled close, and her own ledger open beside it. Gideon sat across from her. She had asked him to be there, sensing that a second pair of eyes wouldn't hurt, and that whatever she found would affect him too. And the Pattersons sat side by side with the careful stillness of people watching someone examine something they can't quite bear to look at themselves. The document was 12 pages long. That was the first thing. A loan document for a small cattle ranch in a frontier county should not be 12 pages long. Helena read it once through quickly, getting the shape of it, then went back to the beginning and read it again slowly, this time with her pencil moving. She found the first problem on page 4, an interest compounding clause written in language so convoluted it took her 3 readings to parse, that effectively doubled the applicable rate under conditions that were defined so broadly as to be almost always applicable. She found the second problem on page 7. A property rights provision that granted the lender certain claims to improvements made to the land during the loan period, which, if exercised, would mean that every fence, every structure, every well Roy Patterson had built in 3 years of backbreaking work could be claimed as partial collateral. She found the third problem on page 11, a default trigger clause that bore no relation to what Roy said he'd been told when he signed. According to the document, Brandt's office could declare default under a range of conditions that had nothing to do with whether the payments were current. She sat back. The lamp flame moved slightly in a draft from somewhere. Roy, she said carefully, when you signed this, did someone explain it to you? Walk you through it? Brandt's man did. Fella named Corbin. Said it was their standard form. Said all the ranchers in the county used it. Did you read it yourself? Roy shifted in his chair. I read some of it, most of the legal language. I couldn't... He stopped. I trusted that it was what Corbin said it was. Helena looked at the document. Then she looked at Gideon, who had been reading over her shoulder and whose face had gone very still in a way that she recognized as the expression of a man seeing something he already suspected confirmed in writing. Gideon, she said, do you have your own loan document, the one you signed with Brandt 18 months ago? He looked at her for a moment. I'll get it, he said, and left the room. He came back with a document that was also 12 pages long. Helena put it beside the Patterson document and compared them, section by section, for 20 minutes in a silence so complete that the sound of the lamp wick burning was audible. They were not the same document, but the problematic clauses, the compounding interest provision, the property rights clause, the flexible default triggers, were identical, word for word, copied from one to the other with the consistency of something designed, not improvised. This was not carelessness. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a template, and it had been used deliberately, on multiple properties, by a man who had been very carefully constructing a mechanism for seizing them. How many ranches in this county have loans through Brandt? Helena asked. Roy and Gideon looked at each other. 7 that I know of, Roy said. 8, Gideon said. There's also the Hensley place, and I think the Drummonds signed something with him in September. Helena sat very still for a moment, looking at the 2 documents side by side under the lamplight. Outside, the night had deepened into the particular quiet of the frontier, that enormous, windswept silence that made the walls of a room feel very small. She closed both documents carefully and folded her hands on top of them. All right, she said, then we need to talk to all of them. Nora Patterson made a small sound that was not quite a word, something between relief and fear, the sound of a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just been told they don't have to anymore. Roy said, Brant he's not a man who takes interference lightly. He has people, Corbin and others. There are stories. I'm sure there are, Helena said. You're not frightened? She thought about that honestly for a moment before she answered. I am frightened, she said, but I have found in my experience that frightened people working together are considerably less frightened than frightened people working alone, and considerably more effective. She began making notes in her ledger, her handwriting small and precise. The first thing we need are the original documents from every affected ranch. I need to compare them. Then we need the payment records. Everything paid, every receipt, everything in writing. If Brant's scheme is what I think it is, the evidence is already there. It's just scattered. It needs to be gathered and organized, and that... She looked up, and there was something in her pale eyes that was not soft and not hard, but something in between. Something that had been forged at a considerable personal cost and was now entirely reliable. That is something I know how to do. The lamp burned steadily on the table between them. Outside, the wind moved through the long grass of the Wyoming plain, and somewhere in the dark distance a coyote called once and was answered by silence. Gideon Mercer, who had said very little in the last hour, who had sat across the table watching a woman he had publicly humiliated 1 month ago systematically dismantle a scheme that he had not even fully understood he was caught in, said something then that cost him something to say. What do you need from me? Helena did not look up from her notes, but something in the set of her shoulders shifted, almost imperceptibly, in the direction of something that might, eventually, become trust. Ride to the Hensley place tomorrow morning, she said. Ask them to come to supper on Saturday. Tell them to bring their papers. He was gone before sunrise. The Saturday supper that followed was not the community gathering that would eventually change everything. That would come later, and it would be larger, and it would be the kind of evening that people in Red Hollow would still be describing to their grandchildren 40 years hence. The Saturday supper was something quieter. 9 people around the kitchen table of the Mercer Ranch, plates pushed aside to make room for documents, voices low and careful, the lamp turned up as high as it would go. The Hensleys came. Martin and June, both in their 50s, Martin with the deliberate movements of a man whose back had been giving him trouble for years and who had learned to move around the pain without mentioning it. They brought their loan documents in a flour sack, which told Helena something about how they stored their important papers and led to a quiet mental note about organizing a better system once this was over. The Drummonds came too. Frank Drummond alone, because his wife Ellen was home with a sick child, and Frank sat at the corner of the table with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who had not slept well in several months. Roy and Nora Patterson were already there when the others arrived. They sat together with the particular closeness of people who have been through enough together that proximity has become a kind of language. Gideon poured coffee. Helena set out bread and cold sliced meat and the last of the apple butter, because people think more clearly when they are not hungry, and because a table with food on it creates a different atmosphere than a table without, something that invites staying, that signals this is a place where you are expected and welcome. Then she opened her ledger and began. She had spent the preceding 4 days doing what she did best, taking chaos and imposing order on it. She had read every document, compared every clause, cross-referenced every provision against the payment records that Roy had brought, and that she had asked Gideon to locate in his own files. And she had built, in the clean columns of her ledger, a picture that was both meticulous and damning. I'm going to tell you what I found, she said, her voice even, her hands flat on the open ledger. I'm going to tell you plainly, because I think you deserve to hear it plainly and make your own judgments about what it means. She talked for 40 minutes. She did not use legal language because she was not a lawyer, and she did not dramatize what she had found because it did not need dramatizing. She explained the compounding interest clause in terms that made its mechanism clear, how it operated, how it had been obscured by the language surrounding it, what it meant for the actual repayment amounts against what each family had been told they owed. She explained the property improvement clause. She explained the default triggers. And then she put the 4 documents side by side on the table and invited everyone to look at the highlighted sections. The silence that followed was the silence of people absorbing something they had suspected, but not been able to name. Frank Drummond was the first to speak. It's the same, he said, his voice flat. It's the same language, word for word. Yes, Helena said. which means he planned this, before any of us ever signed. That is the conclusion I would draw, Helena said carefully. I want to be clear. I'm not a lawyer, and I cannot tell you with authority what this means legally. But I can tell you that 4 loan documents from 4 separate ranches containing identical non-standard clauses, all issued through the same office, is not a coincidence. It is a design. Martin Hensley had been studying the documents with his reading glasses pushed low on his nose. He looked up now. He's been doing this all along. This whole time, every loan he wrote, he was planning to take the land. There's a railroad coming, Gideon said. It was the first time he'd spoken since pouring the coffee. Everyone looked at him. I heard it from Calhoun at the land office. Privately, he told me in confidence, which is why I haven't said anything. A spur line, coming through this valley within 3 to 5 years. Whoever holds the land when it arrives, holds the future, Roy Patterson finished quietly. The room sat with that for a moment. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the eaves of the ranch house with a sound like something breathing, and the lamp flame wavered and steadied. So what do we do? Nora said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something beneath the control. Not fear exactly, but the tight edge of a person who is very close to the limit of what composed patience can hold. This was the moment Helena had been preparing for, in the private hours of her thinking, for the better part of a week. She had turned it over from every angle she could find, the way she turned difficult accounting problems, looking for the approach that addressed the root rather than the symptom, that built something durable rather than just buying time. We need 2 things, she said. We need a lawyer who will look at these documents and give a professional opinion on their validity, and we need to not be isolated. What do you mean, not isolated? Frank Drummond asked. Brant's power in this county comes from the fact that everyone affected by him believes they are alone, Helena said. The Pattersons don't know what the Hensleys signed. The Hensleys don't know what the Drummonds signed. Each of you has been sitting with your fear in private, and private fear is the most paralyzing kind. His strategy depends on that. It depends on each family calculating that speaking up will only bring his attention down on them individually, and deciding that the safest thing is to stay quiet and hope. And how does a supper change that? Frank said, not hostile, genuinely asking. It doesn't, by itself, Helena said. But community does. Unity does. A man who can pressure one frightened rancher privately has a much harder time when that rancher is standing in a room with 8 others, all of whom have signed the same document, all of whom are prepared to go to the county sheriff and the circuit judge together, with evidence organized in a way that a legal authority can act on. She paused. Right now, you have suspicions and fears and documents you don't fully understand. I am proposing to turn those into something a judge can read in an afternoon and act on. Brant has influence with the sheriff, Martin Hensley said carefully. Sheriff Alderman is a complicated man, Gideon said. He's not corrupt. He avoids trouble when he can. Then we make the trouble unavoidable, Helena said. We make it public enough, documented enough, and supported by enough people that avoiding it becomes harder than addressing it. Another silence. Then Roy Patterson looked around the table at the others, a look that traveled from face to face and seemed to take a reading of something. Then he looked at Helena. What do you need us to do? He said. She had a list ready. She always had a list ready. Over the following 3 weeks, Helena Vogel effectively ran 2 operations in parallel, and she ran both of them with the same methodical energy that she brought to everything else. The first was the ranch and the saloon, which continued to grow. The Thursday and Saturday suppers were now drawing customers from as far as 20 miles away, and Cody had become capable enough in the kitchen that she could leave him in charge of the simpler preparations while she managed the more complex work. The second operation was invisible to everyone except those directly involved, the quiet, careful assembly of a case. She rode out to the neighboring ranches twice a week, rain or shine, always with a reason that the casual observer could accept. Delivering bread to the Pattersons, bringing a jar of rendered fat to the Hensley barn where June Hensley was working on her winter candles, stopping at the Drummond place to return a borrowed piece of equipment. And at each stop, she collected payment receipts, correspondence from Brant's office, written accounts of conversations with Corbin that she took down herself in careful longhand and had each person sign and date. She found a family named Webb 20 miles north who had signed Brant's loan the previous spring and were 3 months behind on their adjusted payments. She found a widow named Mrs. Alcott who had sold her property to Brant 8 months ago for a sum that, Helena calculated in about 4 minutes, was roughly 40% of its actual value, a transaction misses. Alcott had agreed to because Brant's man Corbin had told her she had no choice. She added everything to the ledger. The ledger was filling up. It was Gideon who noticed, on the evening of the 3rd week, that she had not slept properly in days. He came into the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night on his way through from the saloon, which had just closed, and found her at the table with 3 lamp flames burning and the ledger open and pages of notes arranged around it in a pattern that made sense only to her, but that clearly made very complete sense to her indeed. He looked at her for a moment. Then he went to the stove, which she had let go cold, and rebuilt the fire and put the kettle on. "You don't have to do that," she said without looking up. "I know I don't," he said. He sat down across from her while the kettle heated, and he looked at the documents spread across the table. The weeks of work they represented, the miles ridden, the conversations held, the evidence accumulated piece by piece with the patient, relentless thoroughness of someone who understood that justice is, at its core, an accounting problem, a matter of getting the numbers to tell the truth. "How bad is it?" he said. "All of it together. How bad?" She looked up. In the lamplight, there were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there a month ago, and her hair had come partly loose from its pins in the way it did when she'd been working for a long time without attending to anything else. She looked, he thought, like someone carrying a significant weight over a long distance who has decided that stopping is not an option. "It's bad," she said honestly. 6 ranches actively threatened. Mrs. Alcott already lost. If Brant triggers the default clauses on schedule, 4 families could lose their properties within 60 days. And the evidence is nearly complete. I need the Webb family's original document. Roy is writing out there Friday. And I need someone to take everything to a lawyer in Carterville who isn't connected to Brant in any way. "I know a man in Carterville," Gideon said. "Elias Marsh. He's old and he's slow and he drinks too much coffee, but he's honest and he knows land law well enough. Can you write to him this week?" "I'll go Thursday." He paused. "Helena." She waited. "Brant is going to find out what you're doing." He said it carefully, not to frighten her, but because he was the kind of man who believed in saying difficult things directly rather than letting them approach from the side. "If he doesn't already know, he will soon. Corbin has eyes in this county." "I know," she said. "Are you—" He stopped, started again. "Is there anything I can do to make it safer? For you, specifically?" She looked at him across the table, across the lamplight, and the documents and the weeks of changed circumstance between them, and something moved through her expression that was not quite readable, but that held somewhere in it a warmth she didn't always allow to show. "Keep the kitchen door locked at night," she said, "and make sure Walt knows to keep his eyes open." "That's all?" "That's enough for now." The warning arrived on a Tuesday, 2 days after Gideon's return from Carterville, where Elias Marsh had spent 4 hours with Helena's ledger and the collected documents, and then sat back in his chair and said, with the careful understatement of a man who has been practicing law for 30 years, that what he was looking at was one of the more deliberate examples of fraudulent loan construction he had seen in this territory. The warning came in the form of Corbin himself, who rode up to the Mercer Ranch on a gray morning with 2 other men flanking him and tied his horse at the post with the deliberate ease of someone who wants it known he is not nervous. Helena was in the yard when they arrived. She had been examining the smokehouse repair that Cody and Walt had finished the previous afternoon, and she did not go inside when she saw them coming. She stood where she was and waited. Corbin was a compact man of about 40, with a carefully maintained appearance that sat oddly with the kind of work he clearly did. His coat was good, his hat was good. His eyes were the flat, patient eyes of a man who has had a great many conversations in which he was the one with the leverage, and who has come to find a certain comfort in that. "Miss Vogel," he said, and the fact that he knew her name without introduction was itself a message. "I'd like a word." "You're having one," Helena said. He smiled, brief, practiced, not reaching the flat eyes. "I think you may have gotten yourself a little confused about some things. Legal matters can be complicated for folks who aren't trained in them. I'd hate to see you cause trouble for the good people of this county because of a misunderstanding." "That's very considerate of you," Helena said. Mr. Brandt is a patient man, Corbin continued, in the same smooth, reasonable tone. He understands that sometimes people form wrong impressions. He'd be willing to discuss any concerns, directly, privately, and clear up any confusion before things go in a direction nobody wants. Tell Mr. Brandt, Helena said, with the same steadiness she had used every time she needed to hold ground that someone else was trying to move her from, that any concerns have already been documented and reviewed by legal counsel, and that private conversations are no longer the approach we're taking. The smooth expression remained on Corbin's face, but something behind it had changed. The flatness in his eyes had sharpened into something more attentive. I hope you understand what you're doing, he said. I do, Helena said. Better than most. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he touched the brim of his hat, the gesture of a man who has learned to make departures look like choices, and turned his horse and rode back toward Red Hollow with his two companions. Walt Pruitt appeared from the barn doorway, where he had positioned himself the moment the three riders came into view. He looked at Helena. You all right? He said. Yes. She turned back to the smokehouse. The upper vent needs to be a quarter-inch wider. Can you and Cody get to that today? Walt stared at her for a moment with an expression that was equal parts admiration and bewilderment. Yes, ma'am, he said. After that, things moved faster. Corbin's visit was a clock. It told Helena that Brandt knew enough to be concerned, which meant the window for preparation was closing. She rode to every affected ranch within the week and delivered the same message. The legal opinion from Elias Marsh confirmed that the loan documents contained provisions that were, in Marsh's professional judgment, fraudulent and unenforceable. A formal complaint would be filed with the county sheriff and a copy sent directly to the circuit judge. But the complaint would carry the greatest weight, would be hardest to suppress or dismiss, if it came not from one person but from every affected party together, publicly, in a way that made the full scale of the scheme visible in a single moment. Together, she said, sitting at the Hensley kitchen table with Martin and June across from her and the early November wind pushing against the windows. All of us. Not separately, not quietly, together. When? Martin said. 2 weeks from Saturday, at the Mercer Ranch. She paused. I'm going to cook supper. June. Hensley looked at her husband. Then she looked at Helena, and something in her face, the long-held tension of months of fear, shifted fractionally toward something that was not quite resolution yet, but was pointed in that direction. What can I bring? June said. In the days that followed, Helena planned two things simultaneously, a supper and a confrontation, and she understood clearly that they were not separate. The supper was the confrontation. A long table, shared food, every threatened family gathered in one place with their documents and their dignity. That was the thing Brandt's strategy could not account for, because his strategy depended on division, and a table pulled people together in ways that were older and more powerful than fear. She baked for 3 days straight, bread in quantities that filled every surface of the kitchen, the great salt pork roast that she'd been reserving the best cut for, potato dumplings by the dozens, lined up on floured boards, 3 pies from the dried apples she'd put up in October, a pot of bean soup that simmered for 18 hours and made the whole house smell like something worth coming home to. Cody worked beside her without being asked, anticipating what she needed with the attentiveness of a boy who has found, perhaps for the first time, a place where his presence is both useful and valued. On the second evening of baking, somewhere around 10 o'clock, he said, without looking up from the dough he was working, "You think this is going to work?" Helena was quiet for a moment. "I think it has a better chance of working than anything else I can think of," she said, which is the most you can usually say about anything worth doing. "What if Brandt just comes anyway, shows up and makes trouble?" "Then he shows up," Helena said, "in front of everyone, and everyone sees exactly who he is and what he does." She shaped a loaf with clean, decisive movements. "Bring the lamp a little closer, please." The Saturday of the supper came in cold and clear, the sky above Red Hollow, the particular deep blue of a Wyoming November afternoon, the air carrying the first real edge of winter. By 4 o'clock, wagons were arriving at the Mercer Ranch in a steady stream. The Pattersons, the Hensleys, the Drummonds, the Webbs from 20 miles north. Mrs. Alcott in a borrowed buggy driven by her nephew, 3 other families Helena had identified in the final week of her canvassing. Sheriff Alderman arrived at 4:30, quietly, without fanfare, having received a letter from Elias Marsh that he'd apparently read 3 times before deciding he could not, in good conscience, not come. Marsh himself arrived at 5, his coat dusted from the road, carrying a leather case that Helena recognized as the one she'd packed with copies of every document 2 weeks ago. Gideon stood at the door of the saloon and watched the wagons coming in, and his face held an expression that Helena noticed from across the yard, something she had not seen on him before, a quality of being genuinely moved, a man seeing something larger than himself assembled in his dooryard. He found her in the kitchen. "There are 43 people out there," he said. "I know," she said. "The bread goes out in 10 minutes. Can you start carrying it?" He almost said something. Whatever it was, he seemed to decide it could wait, and he picked up the first basket of bread and went. The table that ran the length of the Mercer Saloon, every surface pushed together and covered with Helena's best cloths, sat 40 people. The other 3 stood, but they stood close, and they ate, and the room was warm with bodies and lamplight, and the smell of food that had been made with care and purpose. Helena came out of the kitchen only when everything was served, moving along the edge of the room to make sure plates were filled and cups were not empty, exchanging a word here and there with people she had ridden out to see over the past weeks. A hand on Nora Patterson's shoulder, a nod to Frank Drummond, a brief, firm handclasp with Mrs. Alcott that the older woman held on to for a moment longer than a handshake usually goes. It was into this room, warm and full and unified in a way Red Hollow had not been in years, that Silas Brant walked at 6:45 in the evening. He came through the saloon door without knocking, the way men do when they are accustomed to being the most significant presence in any room they enter. He was a tall man, well-dressed in the manner of someone who uses clothing to establish authority, with silver gray hair and the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now simply formidable. Corbin was behind him, and 2 other men behind Corbin. The room went quiet. Not the frightened quiet of people who have been caught, but a different kind, the held, deliberate quiet of people who have been waiting. Brant's gaze moved around the room. 43 people looking back at him. Sheriff Alderman at the near end of the table. Elias Marsh with his leather case open and documents laid out before him. And at the far end, standing very still beside the kitchen door with her hands folded in front of her, Helena Vogel. Something shifted in Brant's face. Not fear, not yet, but the first fracture of the confidence of a man who has walked into a situation he believed he controlled and is discovering, in real time, that he does not. "What is this?" he said. It was Helena who answered. Her voice was quiet and carried perfectly in the silent room. "Supper, Mr. Brant," she said. "You're welcome to sit down." He looked at her, then at Marsh, at the documents, at the sheriff, at the 43 faces watching him with the collective, unfrightened attention of people who are no longer alone. "I don't know what you think he started. "Mr. Brant?" Elias Marsh's voice was old and dry and entirely steady. "I have here signed affidavits from 11 property owners in this county, along with the original loan documents they signed through your office, and a legal analysis of those documents that I am prepared to submit formally to the circuit court on Monday morning." He placed his hand on the leather case. "I would suggest that anything you intend to say this evening, you say carefully." Corbin, behind Brant, took a half step backward. It was a small movement, barely visible. But Helena saw it, and she saw Brant see it too, and she watched the calculation move across Brant's face, the assessment of what he had walked into, the rapid recalibration of a man deciding what could be salvaged. There was nothing to salvage. That was the truth of it, and the room knew it. And after another long moment, Brant knew it too. Sheriff Alderman stood up from his chair at the end of the table. He was a careful, deliberate man who avoided trouble when he could, but he was standing now and his hand was at his belt, and his voice when he spoke was the voice of a man who has made a decision. "Mr. Brant," he said, "I think you and I need to have a conversation, outside." The 2 men left. Corbin followed, and the other 2 men behind him, and the door of the Mercer Saloon swung shut behind them all. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Roy Patterson picked up his fork, and the sound of it against his plate broke the silence, and someone exhaled a long breath that had been held too long, and the room came back to life. Not with the noise of triumph exactly, but with something quieter and more lasting. The particular sound of people who have been afraid for a very long time and have just discovered together that they are not afraid anymore. Helena stood at the end of the table and watched it. This room full of people who had come out of their separate silences and their separate fears and found each other here, around food she had made, in a place that had been dying 3 months ago and was now the most alive room in the county. Gideon appeared at her elbow. He said nothing, but he stood close enough that his shoulder was an inch from hers, and he stayed there. Outside, through the saloon's single window, the Wyoming night was cold and enormous and full of stars, and the lamps inside burned steady and warm and would not go out. The night after the supper, the Mercer Ranch was quieter than it had been in months, and the quiet had a different quality than the silence that had preceded Helena's arrival. That earlier silence had been the silence of something hollowed out. This one was the silence of something that had finally, after a long and exhausting effort, been set down. Helena sat at the kitchen table past midnight. The lamp turned low, the ledger open in front of her, though she was not writing in it. She was simply sitting with it. The way you sit with something that has carried you through a difficult passage, not because you need it anymore, but because setting it aside entirely feels premature. The fire had burned to coals. Outside, she could hear the wind beginning to pick up from the northwest, carrying with it the first real smell of coming winter. And somewhere across the ranch yard, the loose board on the barn she'd been meaning to ask Walt to fix was tapping in a slow, irregular rhythm against its frame. She was tired in a way that went deeper than the physical. It was the tiredness of sustained vigilance, of weeks spent holding a great many things in her mind simultaneously and making sure that none of them fell, while also making bread and managing a kitchen and keeping a ranch from losing what ground it had gained. It was a tiredness she recognized from her years in her uncle's bakery. From the winter, they had nearly lost everything, and she had spent 4 months rebuilding the accounts and the customer base and the reputation, working before dawn and after dark, and had come out the other side thinner and more capable and absolutely certain that she never wanted to do anything like it again. She turned a page in the ledger without reading it. The kitchen door opened, and Gideon came in from outside, bringing cold air with him, and the particular smell of a man who has been standing in the night for a while. Wood smoke and frost and something else, something harder to name. He saw her at the table and didn't look surprised, which meant he had expected she would still be up. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He did not speak immediately. Gideon Mercer had many faults, and Helena had cataloged most of them in the practical way she cataloged things that affected her daily work. But one thing she had come to appreciate about him was his understanding that not every silence needed to be filled. After a while, he said, "Alderman came by before the last wagon left. He told me what Brant said outside." Helena looked up. "He's going to contest it," Gideon said. "The complaint. He told Alderman the documents are valid and the signatures are binding, and any legal challenge will take years and cost more than any of these families have." He paused. He also said, another pause, this one heavier, that he has a lawyer in Cheyenne who has won cases like this before. Those were his exact words, apparently. Cases like this. The fire ticked in the stove. The barn board knocked in the wind. "He's not wrong that it will take time," Helena said. "Are you worried?" She considered the question with the honest attention she gave to all questions worth answering. "I'm concerned," she said. "There's a difference. Worried is when you don't know what to do. Concerned is when you know what to do and you understand that doing it will not be easy. And what do? We make sure Elias Marsh has everything he needs before Monday morning. We make sure the affidavits are signed and witnessed and copied, and that one copy goes with Marsh to the circuit court and one copy goes somewhere that Brant cannot reach it." She looked at him steadily. "And we make sure the families hold. That's the part that worries me most, if I'm being honest. A man like Brant, when he can't win one way, he looks for the weakest point and applies pressure there. He'll go after whoever he thinks is most frightened. He'll make private offers to settle, individual settlements that look like relief but are designed to fracture the group." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Frank Drummond," he said. She nodded slowly. She had thought the same thing. Frank, alone at the supper without his wife, with a sick child at home, and the particular vulnerability of a man who has too many fronts to defend at once. "I'll ride out to the Drummond place tomorrow," she said. "I'll go with you," Gideon said. She looked at him. He met her gaze without looking away, without the fractional hesitation she had grown accustomed to in those first weeks when looking directly at her had seemed to cost him something. All right, she said. Thank you. It was, she realized later, the first time she had thanked him for anything. They rode out to the Drummond place the following morning into a sky that had gone the color of pewter overnight, low and fast-moving, with the smell of snow in it, though no snow had fallen yet. The land looked different under that sky. Flatter, somehow. The distances more austere. The scattered homesteads more isolated against the plain than they seemed on clear days. It was the kind of morning that reminded you what the frontier actually was, underneath the industry and the hope. A very large, very indifferent space in which small human efforts were persistently and magnificently vulnerable. Frank Drummond was in the yard when they arrived, mending a section of fence with the mechanical focus of a man doing physical work because he needs something physical to do. He looked up when they rode in, and his expression went through several things quickly before settling into something careful and contained. "Figured one of you might come by," he said. They dismounted. Helena did not preamble. "Has Corbin contacted you?" Frank set down his wire stretcher. "Letter came this morning, before sunup, near enough." He looked at the fence post, not at either of them. "Private settlement offer. Forgiveness of all outstanding amounts in exchange for quiet title transfer of the East 40 acres." "The East 40, Gideon said. "That's the parcel closest to the proposed rail line." "I know what it is." Frank's voice had an edge in it that was not anger exactly, but the close relative of anger. The sound of a man being pushed somewhere he doesn't want to go and knows he shouldn't go and is afraid he might go anyway. "Ellen's scared. The baby's been sick 3 weeks now and she hasn't slept, and she said to me this morning—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "She said maybe we should just take it. Take what they're offering and be done with it. Keep the rest of the land, keep the house, just let it go. The East 40. "Frank," Helena said. He finally looked at her. "If you take that settlement, you lose the East 40 and you lose the ability to be part of the legal complaint. Brandt's settlement offer will include a clause, it always does, requiring you to withdraw from any current or future legal action against him, you and your family, permanently." She kept her voice even, but she did not soften what she was saying because softening it would have been a disrespect to his intelligence and his situation. "I'm not going to tell you what to do. That is your land, and your wife, and your child, and your decision entirely. But I want you to understand what you are deciding." Frank Drummond stood very still in the cold gray morning. Somewhere in the house behind him, a child coughed, a small, carrying sound through the closed window. "If the complaint goes through," he said slowly, "if the judge rules the way Marsh thinks he will, do we get it back? All of it? Marsh believes the loans will be declared invalid, and the property claims based on them will be vacated," Helena said. "That means yes, all of it. The East 40, everything. Clear title, no debt to Brandt, and any payments already made would be subject to recovery." "How long?" He said 3 months to a ruling if the circuit judge prioritizes it. He believes he will, given the number of properties involved and the weight of the evidence. 3 months was a long time with a sick child and a frightened wife and a man from Brandt's office who would ride out again the moment they showed any hesitation. Everyone in that yard understood that. Frank looked at his fence, at his house, at the pewter sky, and then at Gideon. "What would you do?" he said. Gideon was quiet for a moment. 3 months ago, I would have told you to take the deal," he said. "I would have said protect what you have and don't fight what you can't win." He paused. "I don't think that anymore." Frank looked at him for a long moment. Then he bent and picked up his wire stretcher and turned back to the fence. "I'll talk to Ellen," he said. "Come back Thursday." When they returned Thursday, Ellen Drummond met them at the door herself, the baby on her hip and her eyes clear in a face that looked like it had made a decision and made peace with it. "We're staying in," she said before either of them could speak. "I want that in writing somewhere so everybody knows." Helena added it to the ledger that evening. Every family accounted for, every signature held. In the 2 weeks that followed, Helena turned her attention to the thing that had been waiting at the edge of her awareness since the night of the supper. The piece of the work that was not about documents or legal strategy or feeding 40 people in a room, but about something quieter and, in its way, more important. Cody had been there for all of it, not at the center. He was too young and too uncertain of his own standing to push himself to the center of anything. But at the edges, consistently present, absorbing everything with the quiet watchfulness of a young person who has had to learn early how to read situations in order to navigate them safely. Helena had noticed this about him from nearly the first week, had filed it away in the part of her mind that noticed things and kept them for later. Cody's situation, as she had assembled it from fragments over 2 months, was this. He had arrived at the Mercer Ranch the previous spring as a drifter, 16 years old, with no family she could identify, and the practiced self-sufficiency of a boy who had been on his own for long enough that asking for help no longer occurred to him as an option. Gideon had taken him on because he needed hands, and Cody was willing to work for room and board and modest wages, and there the relationship had stayed, useful, transactional, without the particular quality of being seen that makes a person feel they have somewhere they belong. Helena had begun, quietly and without announcing it as a project, to change that. She started with the bookkeeping. 3 weeks in, she had given him a simple accounting task, tallying the week's saloon receipts against the supply invoices, and watched him do it with a speed and accuracy that surprised her, and clearly surprised him as well, as though he hadn't known his own mind was capable of that particular kind of order. After that, she gave him more. Column by column, page by page, she explained what she was doing and why, in the same direct, non-condescending way she had taught him to build a fire. Because knowledge is a tool, and tools are more useful when you understand the principle behind them, not just the mechanics. One afternoon in mid-November, he came to find her with her own ledger open to the section of Brant-related accounts, which she had left on the table while she went to check on something in the smokehouse. She came back to find him sitting in front of it, reading it with the focused attention he gave to things that interested him, and she sat down across from him without saying anything and let him finish. He was using the interest clauses to manufacture default, Cody said when he looked up. Even when people were paying, the compounding put them behind faster than they could catch up, and then he could call the loan early because of the default trigger. Yes, Helena said. And nobody saw it because the language is, he searched for the word, buried. It's in there, but you have to read the whole thing, and most people can't. And even if they can, the language is designed to be confusing. That is correct. He looked at the ledger again. How did you learn to read it? My uncle had a business partner who was dishonest, Helena said. When I was 19, I found it in the accounts. Not fraud this sophisticated, but the same principle. Numbers that told one story out loud and a different story if you looked at them long enough. She paused. I learned after that to always look long enough. Cody was quiet for a moment. Could you teach me? All of it. Not just the saloon books. The whole thing. Contracts, accounts, how to read what's actually in a document instead of what someone says is in it. Helena looked at him, this 17-year-old boy with no family and quicker hands and mind than he had been given any reason to trust, and felt something move in her chest that was not quite maternal, because she was not old enough for that, and he was not young enough to need it, but was something in the same family, something that recognized an intelligence looking for somewhere to go. Yes, she said, I can teach you that. They began the following Monday, an hour after the morning kitchen work was done and before the afternoon preparations started. Helena on one side of the table, Cody on the other, the ledger between them. She was a thorough teacher and an impatient one when he was careless, but she was never unkind, and she never said anything that suggested she doubted he could get it right with sufficient effort, which was the most motivating thing she could have done for a boy who had spent most of his life being treated as someone without particular prospects. Walt Pruitt, who observed these lessons from the doorway on more than one occasion while pretending to have business that needed attending to in the kitchen, told Gideon one evening that watching the two of them work was something, and Gideon said he'd noticed, and Walt said he thought the boy was going to be all right. And Gideon agreed, and they left it there because they were not men who elaborated on things that had already been adequately said. The circuit judge arrived in Red Hollow on a Thursday in late November, riding in from the county seat with 2 clerks and the particular bearing of a man who is accustomed to finding disorder in frontier counties and is not surprised by it. His name was Harlan Cross, 62 years old, with a white beard trimmed to military precision and eyes that had the quality of instruments designed for measuring the exact distance between what was claimed and what was true. Elias Marsh met him at the hotel and spent 2 hours with him that evening. Helena was not present for that meeting. She was at the ranch, as she nearly always was in the evenings, managing supper, But Marsh came by the following morning with the careful expression of a man trying not to allow his relief to become overconfidence. He read everything, Marsh told her, settling at the kitchen table with the coffee she placed in front of him before he'd finished removing his coat. All of it. Spent most of last night at it, from what his clerk told me. He said, Marsh paused, arranging the words. He said that in 31 years on the bench he had seen aggressive lending, and he had seen predatory lending, and he had seen what he called willful construction of instruments designed to create default, and that what he was looking at fell most naturally into the third category. Helena sat down. That's significant. It's very significant. Marsh wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He's convening a formal hearing Monday. He wants all the affected parties present, along with their original documents, and he is sending a formal notice to Brandt's office today requiring that all foreclosure and transfer actions related to the disputed properties be suspended pending the outcome. The suspension of the foreclosure actions was the first concrete thing, the first piece of the ground that had been shifting for months that held still, finally, under their feet. Helena sat with that information for a moment, letting it settle. Have you told the families? She said. I came here first. She stood up. I'll ride out today. Can you handle the Webbs and Mrs. Alcott? Already planning to. Marsh finished his coffee and stood, moving with the deliberate care of a man whose joints protested the cold. At the kitchen door, he paused and turned back. Miss Vogel, I have been practicing law in this territory for 30 years, as I may have mentioned. In that time, I have seen a great many situations that required this kind of work. The gathering of evidence, the organizing of frightened people, the construction of a case from materials that were scattered and incomplete. He looked at her steadily. I have rarely seen it done better. I wanted to say that. Helena met his gaze. Thank you, Elias, she said. He put on his hat and went out into the cold morning. The hearing on Monday filled the Red Hollow meeting hall beyond capacity, with people standing 3 deep along the walls and outside the open door despite the temperature, unwilling to miss something they understood, even without being able to articulate exactly why, was significant. Judge Cross presided with the measured authority of a man who had long since stopped needing to raise his voice to be heard. Brandt's Cheyenne lawyer was there, a sharp-faced man named Whitfield, who had clearly traveled through the night and arrived with a presentation that had cost someone a great deal of preparation. And he made his arguments with skill and precision and the confidence of a man who believed he was in familiar territory. He was not in familiar territory. He had not seen Helena's ledger. Marsh presented the case with the methodical, unhurried clarity of someone who knows exactly how strong his evidence is and therefore has no need to rush. He walked Judge Cross through the loan documents, clause by clause, using the comparison Helena had prepared. The 4 documents side by side, the identical language highlighted, the financial analysis showing the mathematical effect of the compounding provision on a family making payments in good faith. He submitted the signed affidavits. He submitted the payment records. He submitted a document Helena had prepared herself, a clear language summary of each family's actual financial position relative to what they had understood themselves to owe, compared to what the contract's fine print actually required. Whitfield objected. Whitfield argued. Whitfield deployed every instrument in his considerable legal repertoire. Judge Cross listened to all of it with identical attention, and then he asked Whitfield a series of questions that were phrased with the quiet, precise courtesy of a man who already knows the answers and is giving the other party an opportunity to find them too. Whitfield could not find them. The ruling came 2 days later on a Wednesday afternoon, delivered in the same meeting hall to the same overflow crowd, plus a few additional interested parties who had traveled from neighboring counties when word spread. Judge Cross read it standing, which was unusual, and which the older residents of Red Hollow would later say they had never seen him do before. The loan instruments issued by Silas Brandt's office to the ranching families of the county were found to contain provisions that were, in the court's determination, fraudulent in design and unenforceable in law. All property transfers and foreclosure actions based on those instruments were declared void. All payments made under the fraudulent compounding provisions were to be calculated, and any overpayments were to be credited against the legitimate principal balances remaining. Criminal referrals were being made to the territorial prosecutor regarding the deliberate construction of fraudulent instruments and the coercion of property owners. In the matter of Mrs. Alcott, whose property had already been transferred, the transfer was declared invalid, the deed was to be returned, and Brandt's office was ordered to provide full accounting of any revenues or improvements realized from the property during the period of wrongful possession. When Judge Cross finished reading, the room was silent for approximately 3 seconds. Then Roy Patterson made a sound that was not a word, and June Hensley covered her mouth with her hand, and Walt Pruitt, who had come into town that morning and positioned himself at the back of the room with his arms folded and his face carefully neutral, turned to face the wall for a moment and stayed that way a little longer than was strictly necessary. Helena stood near the side wall and listened to the ruling with her hands folded in front of her and her expression composed. She allowed herself to hear each provision, each declaration, each piece of the thing she had been building for months as it was read into the formal record of this territory's law. She did not cry. She was not, by nature or by long practice, a person who cried easily. But there was something happening in her chest, some loosening of a tension that had been there so long it had become structural, that she let happen, privately, while the room around her came back to life. Cody found her afterward outside, where she had stepped into the cold air while the room was still absorbing the ruling. He came and stood beside her, and for a moment they were both quiet, looking out at the main street of Red Hollow in the thin December light. "It worked," he said, as though he still wasn't entirely sure he believed it. "It worked," she agreed. "What happens now? To Brandt? The territorial prosecutor handles that. It's no longer our work." She looked at the street, the blacksmith, the general store, the livery stable, the buildings that had looked to her 3 months ago like a town that had given up. They looked different now, though nothing about them had physically changed. "Our work," she said, "is back at the ranch. There's bread to start, and I want to show you the quarterly reconciliation method before the end of the week." He almost smiled. Almost, and then all the way. "Yes, ma'am," he said, with a tone that was not subservience, but something more like partnership, the way a person says something to someone they have worked alongside and found reliable. They rode back to the Mercer Ranch together in the early afternoon, the cold air sharp around them, and the Wyoming plain stretching vast and quiet and permanently itself in every direction, and Helena sat straight in the saddle and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific and uncomplicated sensation of being exactly where she was supposed to be. The ledger, back at the ranch on the kitchen table, still had pages to fill. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do, and she had long ago made her peace with that, had come to understand that the work was not the obstacle between herself and some better life, but was, in fact, the shape that her life took when it was going well. But the quality of the work had changed. The emergency was over. What remained was building, and building was something she understood even better than rescue. That evening, she made soup from a ham bone and the last of the autumn root vegetables, and she baked a second batch of bread because the first had gone quickly, and Cody set the table without being asked, and Walt came in from the barn with snow on his shoulders, the first real snow of winter, which had begun falling sometime in the late afternoon, and said it was sticking, and Helena said good, because she had been planning a new dish that required the cold, and Walt shook his head and hung up his coat and sat down. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the snow came down in the long, quiet way of a Wyoming winter, settling in for a stay. And the Mercer Ranch, which had been dying when Helena Vogel arrived, was alive in every room. The snow that had begun falling on the evening of the ruling did not stop for 3 days. It came down steadily, without drama, in the way of a Wyoming winter that has decided to arrive and sees no reason to announce itself, simply settling over the plain and the scattered homesteads and the main street of Red Hollow, in a blanket so white and even that the landscape lost its edges and became for a few days something simpler and more absolute than it usually was. The Mercer Ranch disappeared into the white with everything else, and the world contracted to the size of what you could see from the kitchen window, which was the barn and the fence line and the smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney and the tracks of boots between the buildings, already filling in behind whoever had made them. Helena found she did not mind it. She had grown up with German winters, which were a different kind of cold, heavier, grayer, more relentless in a particular urban way, and the Wyoming snow had a quality she had not expected, a cleanness, a silence so complete it felt almost like a held breath, as though the land itself was resting. She worked in the kitchen with the stove burning high and the windows fogged at the edges, and she baked things that made sense in deep cold, dense rye bread that kept for days, braised meat that improved with every reheating, a thick bean and barley soup that she kept at a low simmer on the back of the stove from morning until night, so that anyone coming in from outside could have a bowl without waiting. The ranch hands came in and out of the cold with snow on their hats and their shoulders, shedding boots at the door, wrapping cold hands around cups, and the kitchen absorbed them all with the particular ease of a room that has been returned to its proper function. This was what kitchens were for, Helena believed. Not just the production of food, but the production of something harder to name. The sense that there is a place where you are expected, where something warm has been made in anticipation of your arrival. It was on the second day of the snow, with the world outside still white and muffled and quiet, that Cody came to her with a question he had clearly been turning over for longer than that morning. He sat down at the table across from her. She was mending an account book whose binding had come loose, a small, careful repair using paste and linen, and he put his hands flat on the table in the way he did when he was deciding how to say something. "What happens to me," he said, "when all of this is settled, when there's nothing left to fix?" Helena did not look up from the binding immediately. She finished the section she was pressing and then set it down and looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he exhaled, "I came here as a hand, room and board and wages. That was the arrangement. But things are different now, and I don't—" He stopped, started again. "I don't want to be somewhere I'm not actually supposed to be. I'd rather know." There was something in the way he said it, the practiced neutrality of a person who has learned to ask for clarity before allowing himself to want things, that told Helena everything she needed to know about the years before the Mercer Ranch. She set down the account book entirely and folded her hands on the table. "Cody," she said, "do you know what double-entry bookkeeping is?" He blinked. "We've been doing it, the two-column method." "Do you know why it works, the principle behind it?" "Because every transaction has two sides," he said, slightly uncertain about where this was going. "Every credit has a corresponding debit. Nothing exists in only one place." "That's right." She held his gaze. "You have been here 4 months. In that time you have learned to manage this kitchen supply accounts, to reconcile the saloon ledger, to read a contract for its actual terms rather than its stated terms, and to bake bread that, frankly, is nearly as good as mine, which I do not say lightly." She paused. "None of that disappears because the crisis is over. You earned it. It belongs to you." He was quiet. "As for where you're supposed to be," she continued, "that is a question you will be answering for the rest of your life, and no one else can answer it for you. But I will tell you that this ranch has need of someone who can do what you do, and I would like, if you're willing, to continue teaching you. Not because I need an assistant, though I do, but because knowledge of this kind is the one thing no one can foreclose on. No Silas Brandt, no fraudulent document, no corrupt instrument of any kind can take from you what you know how to read and calculate and prove." The fire ticked in the stove. Outside, the snow fell in long, patient curtains. "I'll stay," Cody said. It was not a complicated sentence, but it had the quality of something that had been true for a while and was only now being said. "Good," Helena said, and picked up the account book again. "Then let's go over the quarterly reconciliation. I want you to be able to run it independently by spring." He pulled his chair around to her side of the table, and they bent over the columns together while the snow came down outside, and the kitchen was warm, and the morning moved forward the way mornings do when the work in them is the right kind. The formal resolution of the Brandt matter arrived not all at once, but in stages, the way large things tend to resolve. Not with a single definitive moment, but with a series of smaller ones that accumulated into something complete. The first stage came in the second week of December, when the Territorial Prosecutor's Office sent a representative to Red Hollow to take formal depositions from the affected families. Helena had prepared for this with her usual thoroughness. Every family had organized copies of their documents, their payment records, and the signed affidavits she had taken down herself. The representative, a young man named Garrett, precise and slightly overwhelmed by the volume of material he was presented with, spent 3 days in Red Hollow and left with 2 large cases of evidence and an expression that suggested he had not expected, when assigned this matter, to find quite such complete preparation waiting for him. "You've done most of our work for us," he told Helena on his last afternoon, with a tone caught between gratitude and professional embarrassment. I organized what was already there, she said. The families did the hard part. They held together. The second stage came just before Christmas. Silas Brandt, through his Cheyenne lawyer Whitfield, entered into a negotiated settlement with the territorial prosecutor rather than face the full weight of a criminal trial. The terms of the settlement required full restitution to all affected parties. The calculated overpayments under the fraudulent compounding provisions returned in full, along with the permanent transfer of any outstanding loan notes to a county-administered trust, which meant that the remaining legitimate balances owed by the ranching families were now held by a body that had no interest in predatory enforcement. Brandt was also permanently barred from conducting financial or land transactions in the territory. It was not, Elias Marsh told Helena when he brought the news, everything the law could theoretically have extracted. A full criminal conviction would have been more complete. But it was certain where a trial was not, and what it delivered to the families was real and immediate. The land secure, the fraudulent debt erased, the mechanism of their entrapment dismantled. Is Mrs. Alcott's property included? Helena asked immediately. Her deed is being restored as part of the settlement. She'll have clear title by the end of January. Marsh looked at her over his glasses. I thought you'd ask that first. It's what I was most worried about, she said honestly. The others had their land still. She'd already lost hers. She'll have it back. Helena nodded once and was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Elias, she said, for all of it. He waved the gratitude away with the gesture of a man who deflects things he nonetheless appreciates. Buy me a meal next time I'm in the county, and we'll call it even, he said, and put on his hat and went out into the cold. The news traveled through the valley with the particular speed of things people have been waiting to hear. Helena knew it had reached the Patterson Ranch when Nora arrived 2 days before Christmas with a fruitcake wrapped in cloth in both arms, hugging Helena in the doorway of the ranch house with a fierceness that compressed the breath out of her and lasted long enough that Helena, who was not by nature a demonstrative person, had time to decide to simply hold on rather than step back. When Nora finally released her, her eyes were bright but dry. She was still, always, the kind of woman who had decided about tears, and she said, I need you to know that Roy and I talked about this. We want you to know that whatever you need, whenever you need it, from this family, that's a permanent offer, not a debt, not an obligation, just a fact. Helena looked at her. The apple jelly was enough, she said. Nora laughed, a real laugh, full and sudden and slightly undone. You are the most impossible woman, she said. So I've been told, Helena said, and brought her inside for coffee. Christmas at the Mercer Ranch that year was something that none of the people present would ever quite agree on in the retelling, in the way that the best evenings tend to resist being accurately described afterward. The saloon was closed for the day, and the tables were pushed together the way they had been for the great supper 6 weeks earlier, though the mood was entirely different, looser, warmer, without the taut undercurrent of confrontation and consequence that had run through that earlier gathering. The Pattersons came, and the Hensleys, and Frank and Ellen Drummond with their child, recovered now, round-cheeked and imperious in the way of small children who have been sick and gotten well, and know they are owed something for the trouble. Walt Pruitt brought his sister, who was visiting from Laramie, and who spent most of the evening watching Helena manage the kitchen with an expression of pure admiration. Cody sat at the far end of the table and ate more than seemed physically possible for a person his size, and nobody commented on it because it was Christmas and because they were all, in their various ways, making up for something. Helena cooked for 2 days beforehand. She made the things she knew and the things she had been saving for a right occasion. A goose that had been in brine since Tuesday, its skin crisp to the color of old amber. Braised red cabbage with caraway and a splash of vinegar that made the whole kitchen smell like her uncle's restaurant in Hamburg on winter evenings when she was a child. Potato dumplings, which she had made so many times now in this kitchen that her hands knew the process independently of her mind. A plum cake that used the last of the preserved plums she had found on her first night in this kitchen, behind the tin of rusted nails, the small, improbable treasure that had been her first promise kept in Red Hollow. She used them deliberately, consciously, understanding that there was something right about finishing them now. Gideon found her in the kitchen on Christmas morning, an hour before anyone else arrived, in the last quiet stretch before the day became public. She was standing at the window, looking out at the snow-covered ranch yard in the early light, the barn, the bunkhouse, the fence lines she knew now by heart, the smokehouse with its properly fitted vent, the whole particular geography of a place that had become, without her quite noticing the moment it happened, hers. He came to stand beside her at the window. They had been doing this more, standing near each other without needing to fill the space with words. It had developed gradually, organically, the way things develop between people who have worked closely together through difficulty and come out the other side with an understanding that doesn't require constant articulation. 3 months, he said. She looked at him. 3 months ago today, almost exactly. You stepped off that stage. He kept his eyes on the window, on the yard outside. I said what I said. Gideon, I need to say this. He turned to look at her, and she could see it costing him something. Not in the way that things had once cost him, when opening up seemed to require chipping through something solid, but in the genuine way of a person saying something they have wanted to say for a long time and are finally ready to say correctly. What I said was wrong, not just unkind, wrong. I was wrong about what I thought I needed, and wrong about what I was looking at, and wrong about... He stopped, set his jaw, and continued. I was scared. That's the truth of it. Claire had been gone 3 years and the ranch was failing, and I thought what I needed was something practical and uncomplicated, and instead I got you. And you were... He exhaled slowly. You were nothing like what I thought I'd ordered, and everything I didn't know I needed. And I handled that badly, and I have regretted it since about the 3rd morning. Helena was quiet for a moment. Outside, the winter light was coming up slowly, turning the snow from blue-gray to white, filling the yard with a gentle, clear illumination. The 3rd morning, she said, you'd already fixed the smokehouse hinge and reorganized the flour storage, and I watched Cody build the fire correctly for the first time in 6 months. Something moved in his expression, wry and rueful and entirely genuine. I knew by the 3rd morning that I had made a serious error in judgment, and that correcting it was going to require being a different kind of man than I'd been accustomed to being. And are you, she said, a different kind of man? He looked at her directly, steadily, with those slate-gray eyes that she had learned over 3 months to read better than she had once thought possible. I'm working on it, he said. I thought you might have noticed. She had noticed. She had been noticing for a long time in the way she noticed things, but carefully, without announcing it, filing each observation in the part of her mind that kept the things that mattered for when they were needed. Helena. He said her name the way he had learned to say it, without the stiffness of those first weeks. Naturally, the way you say the name of something that has become familiar and necessary. I'm not asking because the ranch needs managing, or because the books need keeping, or because the kitchen needs running. All of those things are true, and none of them is the reason. A pause. I'm asking you to stay because I don't want you to go. Because this place is better than it has been in years, and it is better because of you. And I am better than I have been in years, and that is also because of you, and I would very much like... He seemed to run out of the prepared version and shifted to something less rehearsed and therefore more real. I would very much like to deserve the trouble you've gone to, eventually. If you're willing to see if I can. The kitchen was very quiet. The goose was in the oven and the braised cabbage was at a low simmer, and somewhere outside a horse moved in the barn, a sound that traveled across the still cold air with perfect clarity. Helena looked at him for a long moment. The longer she looked, the more she saw. Not the man who had laughed at her in the street 3 months ago, though that man was still there in the history between them, unchangeable as all histories are, but the man who had rebuilt the morning fire alongside Cody so she could have an extra hour of sleep during the worst weeks of the Brant work, who had ridden to Carterville without being asked, and again without being asked, and a 3rd time without complaint, who had stood in a room full of people and said he was wrong about something, out loud, which she had come to understand was one of the harder things a person of his particular formation could do. I'm already staying, she said. I told you that the 2nd morning. I live here. That's not... He stopped, saw something in her expression. Are you making me ask properly? I'm letting you decide what you mean, she said. There's a difference. A silence. Then the corner of his mouth moved in a way she had been cataloging for weeks. The expression that in another man's face would have been a smile, and in Gideon's face was the private, carefully contained version of the same thing. "Helena Vogel," he said, "will you stay here? With me? Not because the ranch needs you, which it does, and not because the kitchen needs you, which it does, but because I would like to spend a considerable amount of time learning to deserve the kind of woman you are, if you'll allow me the opportunity." She was quiet for a moment that was not, on her end, uncertainty. It was simply the pause of someone tasting something and finding it accurate, finding it, after a long, careful assessment, exactly what it appeared to be. "Yes," she said, "I'll allow that." He exhaled once, slowly, and the thing that had been held tight in his face for 3 months, the bracing, the waiting for things to go wrong, loosened just slightly in the specific and irreversible way of a man who has allowed himself to begin to believe that something good is actually happening. He didn't reach for her hand. He wasn't there yet, and she wasn't asking him to be. But he turned back to the window and stood beside her, and they looked out at the ranch yard together in the growing morning light, and the distance between their shoulders was smaller than it had been. The people came at noon, and the day became what it was, full and warm and loud, in the particular way of a gathering of people who have been through something together and are now, on the other side of it, discovering what they are to each other in the aftermath. Roy Patterson told a story about his grandfather that went on too long and was interrupted 4 times and was funnier each time it was interrupted. June Hensley and Nora had apparently been corresponding by letter since the supper and had developed opinions about each other that they were now testing against the reality of proximity, which seemed to be going well. Frank Drummond's child, a girl of about 2, named Bess, who had apparently recovered from her illness by concentrating all her previously sick energy into a formidable wakefulness, spent most of the afternoon following Cody around with the gravity of a small person who has decided, for reasons of her own, that this particular person is interesting. Cody, for his part, handled this with a patience and gentleness that Helena watched from across the room with a quiet satisfaction she did not feel the need to announce to anyone. He was going to be fine, this boy, more than fine. She could see the shape of what he was becoming the way she could see the shape of bread dough. Not finished yet, not fully proved, but with a good structure underneath, something you could trust to rise. Walt Pruitt found her at the edge of the room, late in the afternoon, when the meal was done and the conversation had settled into the comfortable, unhurried register of people who have no immediate reason to leave. He stood beside her with his coffee and looked at the room. At the people in it, the noise and the warmth, the Drummond baby asleep in June Hensley's arms now, the Patterson boys trading good-natured insults with 2 of the ranch hands. Gideon at the far end of the room listening to Martin Hensley with the particular attention of a man who has learned, recently, to listen better. "You know what this place was like before you came," Walt said. It was not a question. "I can imagine," Helena said. "You can't, quite." He said it without heat, just as a matter of accuracy. It was real quiet, not a good quiet. He looked into his coffee cup. He didn't talk to anybody much. The men did their work, and he did his, and nobody asked about anybody else, and that was the arrangement. It worked, after a fashion, but it wasn't. He gestured vaguely at the room in front of them. "No," Helena agreed. "I've been on 6 ranches in 20 years, Walt said. Never stayed longer than 2 years at any of them. There was always a reason to move on." He looked at her sideways with the directness of a man who has had enough years to have stopped bothering with indirection. "I'm not planning to move on from this one." Helena looked at him. "I'm glad," she said, and meant it simply, without ornamentation. He nodded once, and they stood together in a comfortable silence while the afternoon light moved across the room and the voices of the people in it made the warm, overlapping sound of a community that has remembered what it is. January came in clean and cold and full of work, the way the best months are. The Brant restitutions began processing through the county trust in the 2nd week. Roy Patterson received his overpayment calculation and sat at his kitchen table with the figure in front of him for a long time before Nora came and read it over his shoulder and put her hand flat on his back and kept it there. The Hensleys received theirs and used part of it to repair the root cellar that had been failing for 2 seasons. Frank Drummond paid down 3 months ahead on his legitimate balance and then rode out to the Mercer Ranch to tell Helena in person, because some things, he felt, should be said face to face. Mrs. Alcott received her deed in late January, as Marsh had promised. She came to Red Hollow to collect it herself, dressed in her best, with her nephew driving her buggy, and she stopped at the Mercer Ranch on the way back. Helena made tea and brought out the good cups, the ones she had ordered from the Carterville Dry Goods in December, and they sat together in the kitchen for an hour. And what they talked about was mostly ordinary things: the coming spring, the state of Mrs. Alcott's orchard, the nephew's plans to expand the fence line to the east. But underneath the ordinary things was an understanding that did not require naming, that something had been taken and then returned, and that return was not nothing. It was, in fact, considerable. Elias Marsh sent a letter in February to say that the territorial prosecutor had filed the final instruments closing the Brandt matter, and that his office had received, through official channels, a commendation from the circuit court for the quality of the evidence preparation. He said, in the letter's closing lines, that he had sent a copy of Helena's comparative document analysis to a colleague in Cheyenne who taught land law, with a note suggesting it was among the clearest pieces of legal documentation he had seen from a non-lawyer, and would the colleague like to know who had prepared it. Helena read this letter twice and then placed it in her tin box, the same tin box she had carried off the stagecoach on her first day in Red Hollow, alongside her other important documents. Spring came to the Wyoming plain the way it always does, tentatively, then all at once. The snow retreated from the higher ground first, leaving the lower fields still white, while the ridgelines turned to mud, and then to the first faint, improbable green. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the Mercer property, which had been frozen solid since November, broke up on a Thursday morning in March, with a sound like a long-held argument finally resolved. And by afternoon it was running clear and fast over the stones. Helena stood at the kitchen window and watched the green come back to the land and thought about the year, not sentimentally, but with the practical, grateful attention of someone taking inventory of what has been gained. The ranch was solvent. The saloon ran 3 evenings a week and was turning a profit that she had projected, conservatively, and exceeded, accurately. The smokehouse was sound. The larder was full. Cody could run the books independently and was beginning, with her guidance, to develop his own methods, small refinements to her systems that were sometimes genuinely improvements, which she acknowledged when they were. Walt Pruitt was still here. Gideon was learning, slowly and with the particular difficulty of a man rewiring something that had been set for a long time, to say the things he meant before they became overdue. It was not a perfect life. She did not believe in perfect lives, did not think the frontier or anywhere else offered them. There would be bad seasons. There would be difficult months, arguments, the ordinary irreducible friction of people sharing a life and a work, and the 1,000 small decisions that a ranch and a kitchen and a community require. She knew this, and she was not afraid of it. She was, in fact, looking forward to it, in the specific, grounded way of a woman who has discovered that she does her best work not in comfortable circumstances, but in circumstances that require all of her intelligence and her patience and her stubbornness and her ability to look at a nearly empty larder and find enough, to look at a frightened community and find the courage in it, to look at a man who said the wrong thing on the worst possible day and find, underneath that, someone worth the trouble of staying for. Gideon came into the kitchen behind her. He had been out since first light checking the fence lines on the east pasture, and he smelled of cold air and mud and the particular outdoor smell of a man who has been working. He came to stand beside her at the window without being asked. He had learned over the winter that this was a thing she liked, standing at the window in the morning and looking at the land, and looked out at the greening plain and the running creek and the wide, indifferent, magnificent sky above it all. The east pasture fence held through the winter, he said. Good, she said. We should think about extending it before summer. I was thinking the same thing. A pause. Helena. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with that direct, steady look that had taken him most of the winter to fully arrive at. No hesitation in it now. No fractional pulling back. I'm glad you asked to see the kitchen, he said. That first day. Instead of... He stopped. Instead of going. She held his gaze for a moment. Outside, the creek ran over its stones, and the spring wind moved through the new grass, and the sky was the color of something beginning. So am I, she said. And that was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. Not a grand declaration, not the sort of moment that required any particular staging or ceremony, but the true and simple thing, said between two people standing at a window in a kitchen that had been rescued from silence and filled, over the course of a hard and necessary year, with warmth, with purpose. With the smell of bread that was always, in this kitchen, either just made or just about to be made. With the evidence written into every repaired hinge and reconciled ledger and honest words spoken past the hour when it should have been spoken, that the most durable things are not built in moments of ease, but in the decision, made quietly and without fanfare, to stay and do the work. The Mercer Ranch sat in the Wyoming plain as the spring came fully on, and its kitchen light burned in the evenings, and travelers on the road knew to look for it. The way travelers have always looked for lit windows. Not because they were necessarily going to stop, but because a light means someone is there. Someone is awake. Someone has made something warm, and the world is better for it. Helena Vogel had come 3,000 miles to be a bride. She had become something larger and less nameable than that. The axis around which a failing place had found its balance. The still point in a year of turbulence. The woman who had looked at an empty kitchen and a broken community, and a man who did not yet know how to deserve her, and had seen in all of it enough to work with. She had been right. As she was about most things she committed her full attention to, there had been enough. There always was, if you knew how to look.